In the scorching summer of 1794, a man who had orchestrated the deaths of thousands would finally meet the very instrument of terror he had wielded with chilling precision. Maximilien Robespierre, known throughout France as the Incorruptible, had become the embodiment of revolutionary justice and revolutionary excess. His name struck fear into the hearts of nobles and commoners alike, for under his watch, the guillotine had become the ultimate arbiter of French politics. The irony of his fate would not be lost on history. The same blade that had severed the heads of kings, queens, and countless citizens would soon claim its most notorious advocate. This is the story of how the architect of the Reign of Terror became its final, most symbolic victim. A man whose shattered jaw would prevent him from uttering any final words as he approached the scaffold he had made infamous. Robespierre's execution on July 28, 1794, marked not just the end of a life, but the end of an era. It represented the French Revolution devouring its own children, a fitting conclusion to a period when justice and vengeance had become indistinguishable. To understand the brutal irony of his death, we must first examine the path that led this provincial lawyer from obscurity to becoming the most feared man in France. The French Revolution erupted in 1789 against a backdrop of financial crisis, social inequality, and political corruption. King Louis XVI's monarchy faced bankruptcy while the common people starved. The old feudal system was crumbling, and with it, centuries of established order. Into this chaos stepped Maximilien Robespierre, a 30-year-old lawyer from Arras, who would transform from an idealistic defender of the poor into the personification of revolutionary terror. The revolution progressed through distinct phases, each more radical than the last. What began as calls for constitutional monarchy evolved into demands for a republic, then into the systematic elimination of perceived enemies of the state. By 1793, France was at war with most of Europe, facing internal rebellion and gripped by paranoia. The revolutionary government, known as the Committee of Public Safety, declared that terror would be the order of the day. Robespierre emerged as the leading voice of this radical phase. His political philosophy was rooted in the ideas of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, particularly the concept of the general will of the people. He believed that the revolution represented the triumph of virtue over corruption, and that any obstacle to this moral transformation must be eliminated. This rigid ideological framework would justify the unprecedented violence that followed. The guillotine, invented by Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin as a humane method of execution, became the symbol of revolutionary justice. Unlike previous methods of execution that varied based on social class, the guillotine promised equality in death, a swift, painless end for all who faced it. Under Robespierre's influence, this national razor would work overtime, claiming lives at an unprecedented rate. The period from September 1793 to July 1794 became known as the Reign of Terror. During these 10 months, revolutionary tribunals condemned approximately 17,000 people to death. The guillotine operated daily in Paris, drawing crowds who cheered as heads rolled into baskets. What had begun as a tool of justice had become an instrument of mass execution, with Robespierre as its primary orchestrator. The atmosphere in Paris during this period was one of constant fear and suspicion. Neighbors denounced neighbors, children turned in parents, and former allies became mortal enemies. The law of suspects, passed in September 1793, made it possible to arrest virtually anyone deemed hostile to the revolution. Under Robespierre's leadership, the definition of enemy of the people expanded to include not just counter-revolutionaries, but anyone who showed insufficient enthusiasm for the revolutionary cause. Economic hardship compounded the political terror. Despite the revolution's promises, Bread remained scarce and expensive. The assignats, revolutionary paper money, had lost much of its value. Social tensions ran high as different revolutionary factions competed for power and resources. In this environment of scarcity and fear, the guillotine served not just as an instrument of justice, but as a valve for popular anger and frustration. The international context further intensified the atmosphere of crisis. The coalition wars saw France fighting against Austria, Prussia, Britain, and other European powers determined to crush the revolution. Military defeats and foreign invasions were blamed on internal traitors, providing justification for ever more extensive purges. Robespierre and his allies argued that only through terror could France defend itself against its enemies, both foreign and domestic. By early 1794, the revolution had achieved many of its initial goals. The monarchy was abolished, feudalism eliminated, and a new republican order established. However, the machinery of terror had developed its own momentum. Robespierre, convinced that the revolution remained under threat, continued to advocate for more purges, more executions, and more vigilance against enemies real and imagined. Maximilien Robespierre did not personally operate the guillotine, but he was its most eloquent advocate and systematic implementer. His method was far more sophisticated than simple bloodlust. It was a calculated program of political terror designed to purge France of all opposition to his vision of revolutionary virtue. Standing barely 5 feet 7 inches tall, with a pale complexion and carefully powdered hair, Robespierre cut an unlikely figure as the architect of mass execution. His daily routine reflected his methodical approach to terror. Each morning, Robespierre would review lists of suspected counter-revolutionaries compiled by his network of informants and local committees. He worked from his modest quarters on the Rue Saint-Honoré, surrounded by stacks of denunciations, reports, and death warrants. His handwriting, neat and precise, authorized hundreds of executions with the same care others might use to organize a dinner party. The machinery of terror operated through the Revolutionary Tribunal, which Robespierre helped reorganize to maximize efficiency. Trials that had once taken days or weeks were reduced to hours or minutes. The accused faced a panel of judges who had already decided their fate based on political necessity rather than evidence. Defense attorneys were eliminated as unnecessary obstacles to justice. The only verdicts available were acquittal or death, and acquittals became increasingly rare. Robespierre's speeches before the National Convention were masterpieces of revolutionary rhetoric, combining moral philosophy with practical politics. He would stand at the podium, his thin voice rising with passion as he described the enemies of the people who must be eliminated. His arguments were always framed in terms of virtue versus corruption, the people versus their oppressors. Every execution was presented as a necessary sacrifice to preserve the revolution and protect the innocent. The physical process of execution had become standardized under Robespierre's system. Condemned prisoners were transported from their cells to the Place de la Révolution in wooden carts, accompanied by drummers and surrounded by crowds. The guillotine itself stood on a raised platform, its 40-foot-tall posts painted blood red. The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, performed his duties with professional efficiency, sometimes dispatching dozens of victims in a single day. Robespierre rarely attended executions personally, preferring to remain in his office reviewing more cases and preparing more speeches. However, his presence was felt at every execution through the systematic nature of the proceedings. Each death followed protocols he had helped establish: the reading of charges, the positioning of the victim, the fall of the blade, and the display of the severed head to the crowd. The psychological impact of Robespierre's terror extended far beyond those who actually faced the guillotine. The knowledge that anyone could be denounced, arrested, and executed within days created a climate of paralyzing fear. Citizens modified their behavior, their speech, and even their thoughts to conform to revolutionary orthodoxy. The mere mention of Robespierre's name was enough to end conversations and clear rooms. His network of surveillance was extensive and sophisticated. The Committee of Public Safety maintained files on thousands of citizens, tracking their political reliability, their associations, and their statements. Local revolutionary committees reported regularly on suspicious activities in their neighborhoods. Even children were encouraged to report on their parents' counter-revolutionary sentiments. This system of universal suspicion was Robespierre's greatest innovation in the technology of terror. The efficiency of the killing machine under Robespierre's direction was unprecedented in European history. During the height of the terror, the guillotine in Paris claimed an average of 3 lives per day, with some days seeing dozens of executions. The apparatus operated with clockwork precision. Victims were processed through the system from arrest to execution in an average of just 8 days. The scope of Robespierre's terror becomes clear through the stories of its victims, whose final moments were documented by witnesses, executioners, and the condemned themselves. Among the most shocking cases was that of his former ally, Georges Danton, whose execution in April 1794 marked Robespierre's willingness to destroy even his closest collaborators. Danton, a powerful orator who had helped launch the revolution, found himself condemned when he began advocating for moderation and an end to the executions. During his trial, Danton's booming voice filled the courtroom as he defended himself against charges of corruption and conspiracy. "Show me my crimes," he thundered at the judges. "I have served the revolution faithfully from its beginning." But Robespierre had already decided that Danton's calls for mercy made him dangerous to the revolutionary cause. When Danton was finally silenced and dragged to the scaffold, he reportedly told the executioner, "Don't forget to show my head to the people. It's worth seeing." Marie Antoinette's execution in October 1793 exemplified Robespierre's systematic destruction of the old order. The former queen, now known as Widow Capet, was transported to the guillotine in a common cart, her hands bound behind her back. Witnesses described her dignified bearing, despite the jeers of the crowd. When she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot while mounting the scaffold, she apologized. Her final recorded words. The executioner later recalled that her composure never wavered, even as the blade fell. Perhaps no case better illustrated the arbitrary nature of Robespierre's justice than the execution of Madame Roland, a brilliant salon hostess and political writer who had supported the revolution's early phases. When she was condemned for her moderate views, she famously declared from the scaffold, "O liberty, what crimes are committed in thy name?" Her execution shocked even hardened revolutionaries, as she was widely respected for her intelligence and patriotism. The case of the Girondin 21, moderate deputies purged in October 1793, demonstrated Robespierre's intolerance for political opposition. These men had helped overthrow the monarchy, but opposed the extreme measures of the terror. As they were led to the guillotine, they sang the Marseillaise, their voices gradually falling silent as each was executed. The last to die, Charles-Éléonore du Friche-Valazé, had already stabbed himself with a hidden dagger, cheating the guillotine of its final victim. Children were not spared from Robespierre's justice. 14-year-old Marie-Jeanne Bécu, accused of crying when her parents were arrested, was condemned for showing counter-revolutionary sentiments. The executioner Sanson later wrote in his diary that her youth and innocence haunted him, but the machinery of terror operated without regard for age or circumstances. Even some of Robespierre's supporters began to question a system that could execute children for their tears. By the spring of 1794, the machinery of terror that Robespierre had so carefully constructed began to turn against its creator. The very paranoia and systematic suspicion he had cultivated throughout France now threatened to consume him. His position, once seemingly unassailable, grew increasingly precarious as former allies questioned his methods and enemies plotted his downfall. The beginning of Robespierre's end can be traced to his growing isolation within the Committee of Public Safety. Men who had once supported his radical vision now viewed him as a dangerous liability. Joseph Fouché, the brutal representative who had orchestrated mass executions in Lyon, began to fear that his own excessive violence made him a target for Robespierre's next purge. Jacques Tallien, whose lover Teresa Cabarrus languished in prison awaiting execution, desperately sought to end the terror before she faced the guillotine. Robespierre's behavior during these final months revealed a man increasingly detached from reality. He withdrew from regular attendance at committee meetings, spending days in his lodgings at the Dupleix house, emerging only to deliver increasingly erratic speeches to the National Convention. His longtime ally Saint-Just remained loyal, but even their partnership could not stem the growing tide of opposition. The revolution that had once rallied behind Robespierre's calls for virtue and terror now began to question whether he had become the very tyrant they had fought to overthrow. The economic situation in Paris provided additional fuel for discontent. Despite months of terror, bread remained scarce and expensive. The assignats had lost most of their value, and the promised benefits of revolutionary virtue seemed as distant as ever. Citizens who had initially supported the purges as necessary for revolutionary defense now questioned whether the cure had become worse than the disease. The daily spectacle of executions, once a source of revolutionary enthusiasm, had become routine and numbing. Robespierre's speeches during this period took on an increasingly apocalyptic tone. He spoke of vast conspiracies and hidden enemies, of traitors who had infiltrated the very heart of the revolution. His famous speech of 8 Thermidor, Year 2, delivered to the National Convention on July 26, 1794, would prove to be his political death warrant. In it, he attacked unnamed enemies within the government itself, threatening new purges without specifying his targets. This vague menace terrified his listeners, as anyone might be next. The speech backfired spectacularly. Instead of rallying support, it galvanized opposition. Representatives who had remained silent out of fear now realized that their only safety lay in striking first. The very uncertainty that Robespierre had used as a weapon against others now turned against him. His refusal to name specific targets meant that everyone felt threatened, creating a coalition of the desperate that would ultimately destroy him. The night following his speech, conspirators worked frantically to organize resistance. Tallien, Fouché, and others who knew they were likely targets coordinated their response. They understood that Robespierre's power lay not in military force, but in his ability to persuade the convention and mobilize the Paris Commune. If they could isolate him politically and move quickly, they might survive. The alternative was certain death. The crucial day of 9 Thermidor, July 27, 1794, began with Robespierre attempting to defend himself before the National Convention. But his enemies were prepared. When he rose to speak, he was shouted down with cries of "Down with the tyrant!" and "Death to Robespierre!" The man whose voice had condemned thousands found himself unable to make himself heard above the din. His attempts to justify his actions were drowned out by representatives who had finally found the courage to challenge him. The scene in the convention was chaotic and desperate. Representatives who had sat in terrified silence for months suddenly found their voices, unleashing years of pent-up fear and resentment. Robespierre's face, normally pale and composed, flushed with anger and bewilderment as he realized his support was crumbling. Saint-Just, attempting to defend his ally, was also silenced by the hostile crowd. The revolutionary tribunal that had functioned with such deadly efficiency was now turning its methods against its creator. The arrest warrant was swift in coming. Robespierre, his brother Augustin, Saint-Just, Couthon, and several other allies were declared outlaws by the convention. But their ordeal was far from over. The Paris Commune, still loyal to Robespierre, attempted to rescue him and his supporters. This created a bizarre situation where two revolutionary authorities, the Convention and the Commune, faced off against each other, each claiming legitimacy. Robespierre and his allies were initially taken to the Luxembourg prison, but the prison governor, fearing the Commune's wrath, refused to admit them. They were moved from prison to prison throughout the day, as wardens hesitated to accept such politically dangerous prisoners. Eventually, they found temporary refuge in the Hôtel de Ville, the seat of the Paris Commune, where their supporters attempted to organize resistance. The hours in the Hôtel de Ville revealed Robespierre's final transformation from revolutionary leader to hunted fugitive. Witnesses described him as agitated and indecisive, a stark contrast to the confident orator who had dominated French politics for years. He seemed unable to comprehend how quickly his world had collapsed, how the same mechanisms he had used to destroy others were now being employed against him. The critical moment came near midnight, when convention forces surrounded the Hôtel de Ville. A gendarme named Charles-André Merda burst into the room where Robespierre and his supporters had gathered. In the confusion that followed, a shot was fired. The exact circumstances remain disputed by historians. Some accounts claim Robespierre attempted suicide, but succeeded only in shattering his jaw. Others suggest that Merda shot him in an attempt at arrest. Regardless of the precise details, the result was devastating. Robespierre's jaw was broken, leaving him in agony and unable to speak. The symbolism of this wound cannot be overstated. The man whose eloquence had been his greatest weapon, whose speeches had sent thousands to their deaths, was now reduced to wordless suffering. Blood poured from his mouth, staining his clothes and the revolutionary cockade he still wore. The voice that had proclaimed the necessity of terror was silenced by violence, creating a grotesque parallel to the fate of his victims. Throughout the night, Robespierre lay on a table in the Committee of Public Safety's meeting room, his shattered jaw bound with a crude bandage. Guards watched over him, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed contempt. The man who had once inspired fear in the hearts of millions was now reduced to a pitiful figure, unable to speak, his face grotesquely swollen and bloody. Dawn brought no reprieve. Under the law, Robespierre himself had helped craft. Outlaws could be executed without trial within 24 hours of identification. The same legal mechanism that had streamlined the terror would now claim its architect. There would be no lengthy proceedings, no opportunity for defense, no chance for the eloquent speeches that had once saved him from political destruction. The journey to the scaffold began in the afternoon of July 28, 1794. Robespierre, barely conscious and in tremendous pain, was loaded onto the same type of cart that had carried his victims. The crowd that gathered was enormous, drawn by the spectacle of the terror's architect, facing his own invention. Unlike the respectful silence that had sometimes greeted the execution of popular figures, the mob that lined the streets was hostile and jeering. As the cart made its way through the streets of Paris, citizens threw refuse and shouted curses at the fallen leader. Some called out the names of executed friends and relatives, demanding that Robespierre account for their deaths. Others simply screamed, "Death to the tyrant." The man who had claimed to represent the will of the people now faced their wrath directly. The guillotine awaited in the Place de la Révolution, the same spot where Marie Antoinette, Danton, and thousands of others had met their end. The crowd was estimated at over 20,000 people, the largest gathering for an execution during the entire revolutionary period. The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, who had dispatched so many at Robespierre's direction, now prepared to claim his most notorious victim. When the bandage was torn from Robespierre's jaw to position him properly for execution, he let out a final, agonized scream that witnesses said could be heard above the roar of the crowd. It was the only sound he had been able to make since his wounding, and it served as his last word, a cry of pain that seemed to encapsulate the suffering his policies had inflicted on France. The blade fell at 6:02 p.m., and with it ended not just a life, but an era. The crowd erupted in celebration, dancing and singing in the streets. The terror, which had claimed approximately 17,000 lives over 10 months, was finally over. The architect of systematic state violence had become its final victim, his death marking the beginning of France's slow return to sanity. The immediate aftermath of Robespierre's execution brought a psychological relief that swept through Paris like a physical force. Citizens who had lived in constant fear of denunciation suddenly found themselves able to speak freely again. The surviving prisoners in the conciergerie were released, and the revolutionary tribunals were dismantled. The guillotine, which had claimed thousands of lives, was finally retired from daily use. But the scars left by the terror would take generations to heal. The systematic use of state violence as a political tool had fundamentally altered the relationship between government and citizens. The precedents established during Robespierre's reign would influence revolutionary movements worldwide, from Stalin's Soviet Union to Pol Pot's Cambodia. The very concept of ideological purity enforced through mass executions became a template for future totalitarian regimes. The economic consequences proved equally devastating. The constant fear and uncertainty had paralyzed commerce and industry. Skilled artisans and merchants had fled the country or been executed, leaving gaps in the economy that took years to fill. Foreign trade had virtually ceased as other nations viewed France as a dangerous pariah state. Perhaps most significantly, Robespierre's terror created lasting debates about the relationship between revolution and violence. Political theorists would spend decades analyzing how idealistic goals could produce such brutal outcomes. The concept of revolutionary necessity, the idea that extraordinary circumstances justify extraordinary measures, became a recurring theme in subsequent revolutionary movements, often with similarly tragic results. The international reaction to Robespierre's terror influenced European politics for the next century. Conservative governments used the example of revolutionary France to justify repressive measures against their own populations, arguing that any liberalization might lead to similar bloodshed. The fear of revolution became a powerful force for maintaining the status quo across Europe. The story of Maximilien Robespierre's rise and fall serves as a timeless warning about the corrupting nature of absolute power and the dangerous seduction of ideological purity. His transformation from an idealistic young lawyer advocating for the poor and oppressed into the architect of systematic state terror illustrates how the pursuit of virtue can become indistinguishable from the practice of evil.